If you believe history hides its most powerful stories in the shadows, if you're drawn to the moments that changed the world but were never properly told, then welcome to Tales Sanctuary. This is where we uncover the forgotten voices, the buried courage, and the stories powerful enough to reshape how you see the past. The woman who silenced the guns. The untold story of Janet Mokelu. What does it take to stop a massacre when the world has already turned its back? In 1967, eastern Nigeria was burning. The Biafran War had turned cities into graveyards and villages into ghost towns. Artillery pounded neighborhoods into dust. Starvation became a weapon. A blockade sealed off food and medicine. Millions of civilians were trapped between advancing troops and political pride. The world watched, and then looked away. In the middle of that nightmare, when generals argued and diplomats hesitated, one woman stepped into the crossfire. Her name was Janet Mokelu. History barely remembers her, but on the front line, soldiers did. By 1968, the war had become a brutal stalemate. Trenches cut across the earth like open wounds. The air smelled of cordite and smoke. Young men, barely trained, barely fed, clutched rifles and waited for the next order to charge. Janet Mokelu wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a politician. She was a respected community leader, educated, composed, and deeply connected to the suffering families on both sides of the conflict. She saw what the statistics couldn't show: children with distended bellies, mothers trading heirlooms for a cup of rice, fathers burying sons without coffins. And she made a decision most people would never dare to make. She would walk straight into the war zone, not with a gun, with a message. Her transition from community advocate to secret mediator happened quietly. No announcement, no security detail. She began moving through back channels, church networks, local elders, trusted intermediaries, until she secured something almost impossible: access to military commanders. Getting there meant crossing active front lines. Dense bush, unmarked paths, the constant echo of artillery in the distance. At times, she had to wait for shelling to stop before moving again. Soldiers on edge could mistake a shadow for an enemy scout. One wrong step could have ended her story before it began. But she kept walking. When she finally reached opposing commanders, she didn't plead. She didn't threaten. She did something more powerful. She made them listen. She described the famine not as numbers, but as faces. She named villages. She recounted the cries of mothers who no longer had milk to give their babies. She forced hardened officers, men trained to think in strategy and territory, to confront the human cost of every order they signed. And she understood something critical: pride was fueling the war. So she reframed the conversation. Not surrender, not defeat, but protection of their own people. She leveraged cultural respect, religious influence, and her reputation for integrity. She spoke to their duty, not as commanders, but as fathers, sons, and custodians of their communities. Slowly, doors that were welded shut began to crack open. Temporary ceasefires were negotiated to allow food corridors. Evacuations were coordinated. Certain offensives were delayed or halted. Small pauses in the violence, barely noticeable in global headlines, meant the difference between life and death for thousands. The roar of artillery didn't vanish overnight, but in specific sectors, the guns fell silent. Because one woman refused to accept that war was untouchable. And yet, when the war ended in 1970, her name didn't dominate history books. The generals were remembered. The politicians were studied. The foreign powers were debated. Janet Mokelu faded into the margins. Why? Because her power wasn't loud. It was quiet. She didn't command battalions. She commanded trust. She didn't redraw borders. She interrupted bloodshed. And quiet victories rarely make headlines. Today, the region still wrestles with instability, political tension, and the long shadow of that war. Peace is still fragile. Distrust still lingers. But the lesson of Janet Mokelu feels more relevant than ever. When systems harden and institutions fail, sometimes change doesn't come from the top. It walks through the bush. It steps into trenches. It looks armed men in the eye and says, "Enough." Her story challenges something we rarely question: the idea that only power stops power. In the Biafran frontline, power wore a different face. Not in uniform, not carrying a weapon, but carrying resolve. And for a moment, in one of Africa's darkest conflicts, that resolve silenced the guns. If this story moved you, If you believe the forgotten deserve to be remembered, make sure you like this video so more people can discover stories like Janet Mokelu's. And subscribe to Tales Sanctuary, where we bring hidden history back into the light, one powerful story at a time. I'll see you in the next tale.